In February of 2023, Mattel made an announcement. It was bringing Barney back. The toy and entertainment company bought the franchise more than 10 years earlier, and it was finally ready to debut the purple dinosaur's new look. Images of the new Barney hit social media, and the jokes started immediately.
That's not Barney. They took out Barney's buccal fat? Is no one safe?
The new Barney looks like the purple M&M, and the witch from Snow White had a baby.
They gave Barney contacts, a nose job, and bigger veneers? Sad.
Rhinoplasty, lip filler, cheek implants, brow bone reduction, buccal fat removal, Botox, eye lift.
What have they done?
Oh boy.
Okay, they didn't actually give Barney veneers. He also didn't get a nose job, but Barney did get a glow up, or glow down, depending on who you ask. The new Barney is sleek. He's small, and above all, he's animated. He's no longer the big, fuzzy, goofy live-action dinosaur from the 90s series, the one a lot of us grew up with. Not everyone hates the dinosaur's new look, but for fans of the original Barney, seeing the animated version was a bit of a shock. There was even a hashtag #NotMyDinosaur.
I think anytime you do anything, there's going to be people who will support it and say positive things.
Josh Silverman is the chief franchise officer at Mattel.
And then there's times that people have comments and, have some criticism. And I think that's just the way the world is, and I think we're okay with that.
He's one of the people behind the new animated Barney show called Barney's World.
Another way to look at it is nobody was indifferent, and we love the passion. I mean, the fact that people have taken the time to share their perspective and sort of their point of view is wonderful. I think being part of the conversation, sort of being in the zeitgeist is a good thing.
Josh says Barney's World is more than a reboot. It's offering something he calls nostalgia, tapping into love for Barney with a fresh twist for new audiences. But Hollywood often recycles old franchises to play it safe. A character like Barney already has a built-in fan base, right? Why not capitalize on it? But psychologist Lynn Zubernis says reboots aren't exactly sure bets.
It's a risky endeavor because nostalgia sort of depends on being able to revisit the thing that you loved and having it be the same.
That explains the negative reaction some adults had to Barney's new look. And the response to Barney's makeover isn't exactly unique. People have had strong reactions to a lot of characters, TV shows, and movies from their childhoods that have been rebooted.
There are some fans that, even if they're going to work really hard to get it right, can't even get past the fact that instead of a live action person in a purple suit, it's going to be animated. Even that feels to people like, what? No, that's not how it's supposed to be. Or his eyes aren't exactly right. Or you changed his teeth. Or anything that is a change can mess with that feeling of nostalgia. So fans are really passionate about that.
Passionate is one word. Another is protective. The stuff we loved as kids can be precious to us, even when we've grown up and out of a particular character or show. These things stay with us. They're familiar, they're comfortable, they're safe, in a world that doesn't always feel that way. And for a lot of people, Barney feels like a big purple symbol of nostalgia, a warm hug when they need it most. From Connecticut Public, I'm Sabrina Herrera. This is Generation Barney, a podcast about the media we loved as kids and how it shapes us. Barney made kids feel loved. He was a friend, sometimes even a father figure to Millennials and Gen Zers. To this day, many are finding comfort in this purple dinosaur and trying to put his values into practice. So why do the things we loved as kids stick with us? What draws us back to them decades later? In this final episode of Generation Barney, we try to get some answers. Episode 7, purple-colored glasses. There's one word we keep returning to over and over again in this series.
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia. Nostalgia.
Nostalgia. Nostalgia.
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia.
I've always considered myself kind of a nostalgic person.
Grafton Tanner isn't just a nostalgic person. He's also kind of a nostalgia scholar. In fact, he's written several books about it.
And it was an emotion that I felt early on in my life, and I didn't quite know how to categorize it because it didn't feel quite like happiness and it didn't feel quite like sadness. It was somewhere in between. It contained flavors of both.
Grafton first got interested in nostalgia when he went off to college in 2009. He was a musician back then and started noticing that sounds from the past kept popping up in music. Like a lot of indie music he heard mimicked the sounds of the 1980s. Think Tame Impala, Neon Indian, and M83. Grafton got really interested in trying to understand why we look to the past, especially in the US, where we often preach progress. He found that nostalgia is everywhere now. It's baked into every part of our culture. Movies and television, yes, but also politics, fashion, and social media. It might feel like we're at peak nostalgia today, but the concept's been around a while, as far back as 1688, when 19-year-old medical student Johannes Hofer coined it.
The term comes from the Greek for sickness and homecoming, longing and homecoming, or sickness and homecoming. And so it kind of breaks down literally into like homesickness.
When the term was first used, people thought nostalgia was an illness.
This is what they thought, in the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s. People would contract it like a disease when they moved too far from their home.
Over time, the medical establishment dropped nostalgia as a disease, and it morphed into what it's become today, an emotion, and an incredibly powerful one at that.
There's a time and place for every emotion. There's a time and place for nostalgia. We have to ask ourselves, is now the right time to feel nostalgic? Is that what we really need, or do we need hope? Do we need anger? Or do we need nostalgia?
Whether or not we need it, what can nostalgia do for us? Some studies say it can give us meaning, a way to connect to things, places, and people we value. Nostalgia can be triggered by seeing or hearing something that reminds us of the past, but it can also be something that people turn to because of a crisis, like a kind of coping mechanism. A crisis can drive us back to a time when things were simpler, or at least felt that way.
It's kind of a cushion or a weighted blanket, if you will, or training wheels, or just things that can help us, I should say, get used to change.
The crisis can be personal, like losing a loved one, or the crisis can be something more global, like the COVID-19 pandemic. At least, that's when some Barney fans you've met in this podcast return to the character, like Barney collector Andrew Olson or the Purple Dino Puppeteers.
He came back into my life like the exact moment that I needed him most, even though I didn't know I needed him.
During the pandemic, I really had that new rediscovering of my appreciation for the show, the character, and the people that made it.
In times of crisis or not, nostalgia can be just like a hug. That's according to the clinical psychologist and fandom expert, Lynn Zubernis.
Nostalgia has psychological, social, even like existential benefits for us. So that's a big part of it too. Going back and revisiting something that you loved as a child when life was much simpler and you could look at Barney as this sort of caring, loving, like that's all that there was. Life was good at the time. That feels really good to us to go back and revisit that. And people don't want that messed with. They're protective of that. They want to be able to have that nostalgic experience and be transported back to that simpler time in their life. It's good for us to do that.
So yeah, nostalgia can be good, but there's also a flip side to it. Nostalgia can take us away from the present, and not always in the best ways. It might make us remember things inaccurately, and ignore historical facts, like seeing things through rose-colored glasses. Too much yearning can also trigger feelings of depression. But sometimes, we just can't help but feel drawn to what we remember as a simpler time. And lately, it feels like we're nostalgic for one particular time period, the 90s. Scroll through TikTok or shop at Target today, and you'll see that the 90s are alive and well.
I find the decade fascinating as a kind of hinge point between the 20th century and the 21st century, and a kind of gateway from, if you like, the analog era of 20th century media and culture into our own fully digital 21st century.
James Brooks Smith teaches English and film studies at the University of Ottawa. He's written a book about the cultural history of the 1990s.
I was 11 at the beginning of the 90s and 21 at the end of the 90s, so you could say the decade formed me.
When I think of the 90s, R&B girl group and absolute queens TLC immediately pop into my head. But James thinks about
so many things. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, third wave politics, the golden age of hip-hop, the early days of the internet, a certain kind of euphoria, I think.
that euphoria was on full display at something called 90s Con in spring 2024. Think Comic-Con, but packed with stars from your favorite 90s shows. Boy Meets World, Full House, Dawson's Creek, you name it. Hundreds of people showed up in Hartford, Connecticut for the weekend-long 90s Fest.
I love the 90s because it was a very unique time. You know, the outfits, the hairs, the cultures, everything. I actually wasn't born. I was born in 1997, so I didn't really get to experience it. But I did grow up with a lot of different 90s shows like Blue's Clues, PBS kids shows like Arthur and Zoom. And I would have loved to experience it, like be a kid in the 90s if I could.
You have to understand in the 90s, like, we had a lot of things happen for us. Like, we went from like color TVs to like HD in no time. We went from like shitty computers to like great computers in like no time.
Back in the day, it was less digital stuff. You know, people on their cell phones. Even the games had changed. Physical media, being able to just play something and not have to worry about an update or an install. Being able to actually go to the store and buy stuff. You know, remember Blockbuster? I used to rent games from Blockbuster. It doesn't exist anymore.
The 90s felt different. It was a time before Spotify and Netflix and even YouTube. The World Wide Web was still in its infancy. But 90s expert James Brooks Smith says that there's a certain irony in looking back at that decade with nostalgia.
And the 90s itself was looking back to the 70s and the 60s with a similar nostalgic glow.
So while people in the 90s were nostalgic for the 60s, today we're nostalgic for the 90s. Even people who didn't grow up in that decade feel a kind of vicarious nostalgia for it, like those 90s Con fans you just heard from. It's all part of this theory that there's a 30-year cycle of nostalgia. Can you believe the 90s were 30 years ago? Insane.
It's children looking back to their parents' cultural tastes. In a sense, it's grown-up, middle-aged people looking back on their youths. So there is a kind of 30-year cyclical movement, it would seem, within the culture for something to cease to be new and cutting edge and to be available for retrospective, nostalgic recycling.
So it makes sense that a character like Barney is coming back now. I mean, Barney and Friends hit PBS just over 30 years ago, around the same time as Friends or Seinfeld. Those shows recently hit streaming services and blew up with new Gen Z fans. And sure, Barney's transformed into an animated character, but he's pretty much the same lovable dinosaur, one that might appeal to a whole new generation of kids. Because the kids who grew up with Barney in the 90s, a lot of them are becoming parents themselves now.
Everybody knows the purple dinosaur.
Josh Silverman, Mattel's chief franchise officer again.
So we were excited to have a program that could be great for kids and sort of their discovery of it, as well as adults who now have kids of their own and have the ability to reconnect to it. And the co-viewing that exists here we think is really special and pretty unique.
More on that after the break. I'm Sabrina Herrera. Generation Barney is sponsored by BetterHelp. Therapy is a great way to bring yourself comfort, even as the seasons change. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, BetterHelp is entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible. You fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a therapist. Find comfort this December with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/dino today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/dino. Hi, I'm Sabrina Herrera. Generation Barney is sponsored by Masterclass. For a gift that lasts a lifetime, you can't do better than Masterclass. You can learn subjects like how to create documentary films with Ken Burns, or how to build a fashion brand with Diane von Furstenberg. With Masterclass, your loved ones can learn from the best to become their best. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/dino for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/dino. Masterclass.com/dino.
The thing about a Barney reboot is that my kids have no idea who Barney is.
Catherine Van Arendonk is a critic at Vulture.
That is not a reboot designed to give you a character because kids already know who it is and it's going to be easy to market. That is a reboot designed for me as the parent because I know who Barney is.
The new animated Barney appeals to those kids who were Barney fans in the 90s and early 2000s and are parents now, like Karan Stark. He's a super fan and creator and host of Mr. K's Clubhouse. You met him last episode. Karan is now the proud father of 3 little kids, Lula, Onyx, and Cairo. He's introduced all 3 to the 90s series Barney and Friends. But Onyx is the biggest fan. She's 3 and she can literally watch the show all day long. And if she's not watching it, she's listening to the songs, like her dad used to.
I think for all parents, when you can share something that you love with your kids, whether it's sports or a TV show or music, that's something that's very rewarding because you can bond with that. And ours just happens to be Barney, and this purple dinosaur that has just provided us with this avenue of showing each other even more that we love each other. She randomly does this thing where she'll just come to you and go, "Daddy," and you're like, "Yes." And she just goes, "I love you." And I love that she can do that.
Karan says Onyx and Cairo are even into the new Barney's World animated series. To them, it's one and the same as the original PBS show. Personally, Karan wishes there was more music in Barney's World, but Onyx likes to sing along to the new animated Barney the same way he did with Barney and Friends. When Karan watches Barney and Friends today, he gets to see it through a new lens, the eyes of his daughter. Whether Barney's teaching her about love or that triangles have 3 sides.
I feel like I'm seeing a mirror of myself at that age.
Onyx isn't just a mirror for Karan. She's also like a time machine. Her love of Barney transports Karan right back to childhood, a time when he didn't have too much to worry about and could just sing along with his favorite purple dino or play with his new Lego set.
As you start to grow up, we start to, unfortunately, a lot of us lose our imaginations, or we lose that touch to our childhood because bills are due, or we have kids now and families and multitudes of other things happening that you don't always get to just focus on those times growing up where everything just felt all right and felt okay and you were just safe and comfortable. And I think that's what nostalgia is for all of us.
When we set out to make this podcast, we wanted to understand more than just the impact of Barney. We wanted to understand why the media that we loved as kids has such a lasting impact on us. And what we found was that our childhood has a special hold over us.
It's our formative years.
Ryan Lazardi is a professor at SUNY Polytechnic Institute, and he researches nostalgia.
It's the time in which we were growing up. Whether or not it was perfect, it's definitely, if we go back to the memory studies, it might represent one of the largest portions of our life that we still remember.
When you're little and the world feels full of discoveries, that novelty helps create those core memories. Ryan says that's harder for adults.
Unless something happens to me, I'm not going to remember this drive home a year from now, 3 years from now, 10 years from now. But the stuff from our childhood, I mean, I still have, I'm assuming many folks do as well, I still have lots of memories from childhood that are so innocuous and so just bland, but they exist. I can remember what the house I grew up in. I can remember details about the house that I would never remember about an apartment that I lived in from 2015 to 17.
This is especially true for early childhood, according to Ryan.
I think that a lot of the stuff that exists from our childhood is tapping into a part of our memory that is so rich and so vivid compared to what we remember now, that I think that's a huge part of it.
But childhood wasn't always this way. Sherry Hope Culver teaches children's media at Temple University.
So this whole idea of protecting children through childhood is a more recent focus.
Sherry says there was a shift in the 1960s and 70s. Before then, the idea was that children should be seen and not heard. Then came more research into what children needed to develop, and the focus for parents shifted to protecting kids.
Creating this environment where kids can have this idyllic, maybe not 18 years, but at least, 10 or 15 years where they don't have to worry about anything except going to school, being in a loving family, getting to go to Disney World, those sorts of goals is where our childhood sort of parenting has shaped in the last, 20 or 30 years.
So a lot of us like returning to that time in our lives. It feels warm and fuzzy. And so does revisiting characters from our childhood like Barney. James Brooks Smith, the 90s expert, says that can help us meet an emotional need.
And in a world that seems turbulent, full of uncertainty, violence even, a world that has become more polarized and conflict-ridden, it's entirely understandable that we'd seek the comfort of not just the past, but our youths, our childhoods.
In a way, James says that Barney himself is a good metaphor for nostalgia.
He is somebody who could literally embrace you with his soft arms and was available as a cuddly toy, certainly. We can think of nostalgia in these metaphorical terms, but Barney's a great example because it literalizes that metaphor.
For some kids, Barney was love personified. He was caring and affirming and always told us, "I love you." All things that benefit really young children, according to psychologist Lynn Zubernis.
You hope that the young child is getting those messages from other people in their life, their parents, their caretakers, their siblings, whatever. But for some children, parents might be working 3 jobs. It's really hard to find the time to just sit down and say, hey, you matter. Your feelings matter. How are you feeling right now? You're doing well. This is great that you did this. And Barney provided that for a whole generation of kids. And I think that's why there's so many people who are still really so attached to Barney to this day and still passionate about him.
But there might be another reason why some adults are still attached to Barney.
I think millennials are in a unique situation just in the cultural context that they have happened to grow up in. I mean, here they are coming into their own adulthood, becoming parents themselves in the middle of a pandemic, in the midst of all kinds of social upheaval, in the midst of climate change.
Now, Lynn might be talking about millennials specifically, but a lot of this applies to younger generations like Gen Z too.
This is a tough world to come into adulthood in, and the tougher people's current circumstances are, the more they're drawn to nostalgia and the more benefit they can get from nostalgia.
One of the big benefits, it can help people make meaning of their lives. at a time when the present and even future can sometimes fill us with existential dread.
So going backwards and engaging in nostalgia, it helps them bring meaning to their life because it gives them a sense of self-continuity. Like going back to that thing that was important to you, that helped you establish your identity, and revisiting it as an adult, it gets you back in touch with yourself from that time. That helps you feel very authentic. It helps you feel like, okay, I'm still the same person. I'm still connected to who I was then. That's really reassuring, and it decreases that sense of existential dread and increases that sense that, okay, there's coherence, there's continuity, there's meaning in my life. And I think millennials, more than perhaps any other generation, they really need that.
Coherence, continuity, just like we loved the repetition and predictable safety in each episode of Barney and Friends. We sometimes look to recreate that in our adult lives when we seek out nostalgic media. Because childhood was at a time before we had jobs and bills and all of the stuff that comes with adulthood.
We're all grown up now, obviously, and, things like student loans and rent and insurance and all those things.
And because of that, puppeteer and Barney fan Brandon Smith says it's easy to look back with a kind of longing.
Starting families, and as nice as that is, there's the stress of, starting a family, raising your own kids, being married and all that. So everyone wants to go back to the simpler times. And I feel like maybe watching shows like that kind of let us go back to our childhood for a minute and just relax for a while. My legs crossed, my gushers in my hand, I'm just watching TV.
What Brandon's getting at, that watching shows like Barney and Friends can bring us right back to our childhood living rooms, that's something that transcends generations. Because everyone is shaped by something. And for a lot of us, that is television. Almost everyone we interviewed for this podcast lit up when we asked about their favorite shows as a kid.
That would be Bugs Bunny.
Captain Kangaroo.
I loved The Partridge Family when I was little.
Gene London was a pivotal show for me.
One of them was Full House. I spent so much time watching Full House as a child.
For kids today, it might not be Full House or Barney and Friends that transport them back to today 20 or 30 years from now. But it might be something like Bluey, the animated show about the Australian dog, her sister, and her parents. You've probably seen the Healer family everywhere by now. There are dozens of think pieces in outlets like The Guardian and Los Angeles Times asking some variation of, why is Bluey such a cultural phenomenon? And you can't step inside retail stores without seeing Bluey plushes, books, sippy cups, clothes, blankets, bed sheets, and more. Sound familiar?
Stupendous!
Even though it's everywhere, Bluey is still one of TV critic Catherine Van Arendonk's favorite children's television shows.
I remember sitting down and watching a couple of them and then being like, oh my God, actually this is incredible.
She's even writing a book about it. Remember, not all parents loved watching Barney and Friends with their kids, but some of them used him as a surrogate babysitter, someone that could entertain their kids while they got the chores done. There are TV shows today just like that, like Paw Patrol or Cocomelon. But there are also shows that resonate with both young and older viewers alike. For Catherine, that's Bluey.
The big difference between Bluey and Barney is that Barney is so singularly focused on a child's perspective. And by inviting the parents in and centering them, Bluey is also making space for more adult approval of it.
So you don't know where I was before I was born?
Nah.
Oh.
You'll have to figure that out for yourself.
How do I do that?
I'm sure you'll work it out. You figured out how to avoid capture by the police.
Bluey's far from the first kids show to try to appeal to adults' needs too. Like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came to television screens in the post-war era, a time when kids and adults alike felt like,
I would like a gentle, comforting authority figure to just tell me it's going to be okay and tell me how to behave in the world, right?
And Sesame Street started around the end of the civil rights era of the 60s, when parents and kids were learning more about race and inclusivity.
We all live in a community together. We're moving toward post-colonial studies. Like, we understand that we live in this multicultural world and that we sort of all inhabit the same spaces together.
But Catherine says Bluey does something different than Mr. Rogers or Sesame Street or Barney. It brings the setting back to the home and the family.
This family where children play, adults play with them, adults have their own needs and desires that are different from the kids, adults look at the kids and remember what it was like to be a child.
And Catherine says it feels like it's designed for kids and parents.
And at the same time, the children observe the parents and wonder what is happening in their parents' perception. And that really lovely and just gorgeous kind of multiple perspective gives Bluey this access point for kids and adults that I think is so different from anything that has really happened in children's television before.
It makes sense, she says, given when the show came out in 2018. Because what families and kids need today is different from what they needed in the era of Mr. Rogers.
Bluey comes at a moment when we have this overwhelming pressure on parents to be engaged in their kids' lives to an extent that was simply not expected of parents in previous generations.
So there's more pressure for parents to be involved, including in watching those shows with their kids. Bluey comes out in the age of gentle parenting, the idea of treating kids with respect and empathy, giving space to their feelings. Bluey's parents, Bandit and Chili, are loving and playful and actively engaged with their kids, something many Millennial and Gen Z parents are hoping to do in real life. In some ways, Bluey is the show embodying this new style of parenting. Bluey is helping raise a lot of kids and even parents today, just like Barney did for me and my mom in the 90s.
I was part of it. I mean, I'm Generation Barney. I was not a child, but I was a mom, but I feel like I'm Generation Barney.
I sat down with my mom, Liliana Herrera, to talk about Barney. Before working on this podcast, I didn't realize just how big an impact this purple dinosaur had had on me and my entire family. My mom told me stories about what I would do when I watched Barney and Friends as a kid.
And every time they sing the songs like You Come and Hug Me, or You Hug Your Sister, it was the purest thing. You're getting out the children good emotions, feelings, making the difference.
Barney let me get out all my feelings back then, and I had a lot of feelings. But my mom thinks Barney stuck with me. She sees a lot of him in who I've become.
I firmly believe that your character, the person who you are, is things to what you were exposed. And you carry all that with you. That's how do I see it. So it's amazing. And seeing you growing up, how you were all till become an adult, go to school. I mean, I think that Barney, because you're Barney, part of Barney, open a window to the world, sending you there with confidence, with that strength that don't be afraid, go for it. You are motivated, you can do it. Try and find a way here, there.
Barney and other shows I watched as a kid helped me connect to my mom and also to myself. And as we've worked on this podcast, I've realized that hasn't stopped. Because the shows we watch when we're young, they have a very real and lasting impact on our lives. There's not a ton of long-term data on the subject, but experts say that's true for shows like Sesame Street.
You can look back on those characters and those experiences, but mainly when you look back, do you really look back on I learned 1, 2, 3?
Sandra Calvert is professor emerita of psychology at Georgetown University.
Or do you look back and you think about how that character made you feel? I mean, when somebody talks about Barney, what do they say? I loved Barney. He made me happy. You know, I really had fun with him doing this, that, and the other. It's more social emotional.
And Sandra says, anecdotally, we seem to carry these shows with us forever.
You always keep these little kernels, just like you have little pieces of your parents and your family members and your friends that you carry with you forever, that shaped who you became, and that you love them and you always remember those things. That's how you feel about some of these characters, too.
You might not realize it, but the TV shows you watched or the books you read as a kid were likely formative to your identity. You probably absorbed a lot of the messages you heard or saw from that time, creating a kind of foundation for who you'd grow into. Kernels, as Sandra describes them, or maybe building blocks, according to psychologist Lynn Zubernis.
And while identity development goes on through your entire lifespan, it doesn't ever stop. Those early building blocks are still there. They're still the early building blocks that you use as you go through development. So I think it has a big impact. And I think we instinctively kind of know that. And that's why we do have so much nostalgia for the things that we loved when we were very young.
We don't realize how foundational these things are when we're still kids. But looking back as adults, it becomes more clear how those kernels or building blocks are still with us. Hindsight is 20/20, right? That's what we heard from the Barney fans we spoke to for this podcast.
He means everything, you know. He's metaphorically my best friend. Someone that, you know, the idea of Barney is something that I want to live up to. You know, I love you, you love me. I call it the purple mantra.
Barney was like the most constant thing I had, and it was kind of my safety net, so that's why I either carried him with me or I just watched him constantly. I just felt more safe when I was with him.
I mean, I think what Barney instilled in me is what he instilled in all of the children who watched him, you know, which was an openness, curiosity, playfulness, love, you know, caring for friends and family.
There was something about the unconditional love that Barney would provide that really made him feel like a friend, and then I could watch that and there'd be no cares and it was just fun and relaxing, and I felt like I connected with him as a friend, and I felt like when Barney would talk to the camera, I felt like he was talking to me.
Anytime Barney was on, I just remember happiness and like a safe place, if you will, about nothing else mattered for those 25 minutes or an hour, however long the videos would be that I watched. Back to back, just constantly rewinding or putting in a new one. Nothing else mattered, just I was centered and grounded with that character and the people in that world, and just happy. There was no sadness or anything that you felt when watching that show and being involved with it.
It's easy to dismiss kid shows like Barney and Friends. It's easy to grow out of and be embarrassed by them. But the truth is that they do shape us, in ways big and small. That's why we keep coming back to them, to remind us of who we are and how we've grown. Because the things we loved as kids are sacred to us. For me, that thing is Barney. For you, it could be something totally different. And consciously or subconsciously, these things stay with us throughout our lives, helping us become the people we grow into. This episode was reported, written, and produced by Meg Dalton and Lily Tyson. It was edited by Cassandra Basler. Sound design and mixing by Jay Cowett. Jay also composed the podcast theme. Additional music in this episode from APM. Megan Fitzgerald is our project manager. Additional editing help from Patrick Scahill, Megan Fitzgerald, and Chloe Wynn. Special thanks to Catherine Shen, Janae Spinato, Frankie Graziano, Chris Polanski, Kevin Chang Barnum, and Tyler Russell for their voice acting chops. Thanks also to Katie Tolarski, Claire Piazza, Carol Sisko, Bradley O'Connor, Jordan Shimon, Robert Burial, Tracy Wu Fastenberg, Alia Miller, Walter Smith Randolph, Megan Flynn, Cynthia Herrera, Alexander Bowen, Alex Neff, Marika Bonacorsi, Letitia Peters, and Joey Morgan. Thank you to Jamie Kren and Caitlin Benson-Allett, whose work helped inform this episode. Thanks to all the Barney fans we spoke with on this journey, and all of the audio engineers who made our interviews possible. Marketing support provided by the Podglomerate, program identity package provided by Media Vision Creative, legal review by Lou Levy from the firm Lerman Center, PLLC. Lauren Komrosky is our Chief Digital Officer. Vanessa De La Torre is our Chief Content Officer. Generation Barney is produced with support from PRX and is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. A special thanks to PRX's Stephanie Kuo, our muse and fairy pod mother, and also Mike Russo, Grace Abler, and Tony Carlson. To learn more about the podcast, visit ctpublic.org/Barney. I'm Sabrina Herrera. Generation Barney is a production of Connecticut Public.
Great job, Sabrina.
Do I need to do that again?
No, Meg, anything we need to retract?
No, it's done.
Yay!
Congrats, everyone.
Yay!
Save the file.
Oh, yeah.
Oh boy.